Begin. So we're still on the first Mishnah slash Brisa of the 6th chapter of Pirkei Avos, which started off by telling us that this is Belosha in our Mishnah. It's the language, the style that is used in the Mishnah, but it's not exactly, because it is a Brisa. And we started off with Rabbi Meir teaching us that Kol ha'osek v'Torah lishma, any person who engages in Torah study for its sake, zoiche lidvarim harbe. Remember this? That person merits many things. Now, one of the questions that we asked when we first encountered this was, and this is relevant especially now because we're going to start looking at the list. It's a long list of things that apparently, when it says Devarim Harbe, many things, there seem to be many things on the list. So one of the questions we asked is, it doesn't make sense. If a person is studying Torah lishma, for the sake of Torah, then what's the difference if they're going to get things? That seems to be the opposite of learning Torah for lishma, for its sake. So what's going on over here? Are we learning Torah for its sake, or are we learning Torah because of the expectation of the things that a person is going to receive? So in order to get a bit of perspective before we actually start to explore the list, let's remember this principle. Principle everybody is familiar with. You know this principle really well. What's the principle? Mida keneged mida. You familiar with this? Yes? Everybody knows this principle. Mida keneged mida. That Hashem does things for us, measure for measure. And there are all kinds of examples. In fact, there's a major section in the Gemara in Sota that goes through example after example after example of mida keneged mida, both in the positive and in the negative sense of things. That when a person behaves in a particular way, they can anticipate that Hashem will respond in kind. Great. Let's drill that a little deeper. Why? Why is it mida keneged mida? Or to put it a little differently, if Hashem is going to, for whatever reason, create a consequence for a person's behavior that suits their behavior, we kind of understand that because, after all, the way that a person behaves kind of sets up their reality and then they're going to get something in kind. But when there is something positive, when a person does a mitzvah, why is it that Hashem designs that the response to the mitzvah is going to be similar to the mitzvah itself?
I think when you do the mitzvah, you change yourself.
Okay, that's true, you do. But why does that explain how the mitzvah is going to be associated with a particular reaction? So we have a principle, very interesting principle, that goes like this. Mischara neida mehusa. From the response or the reward for something, you can understand the essence of what that thing is. And the truth is, this could apply equally on the positive and on the negative. Now, but that's a principle, that whatever happens, whatever Hashem is offering us, is in itself an insight into what the means or what the purpose of that particular mitzvah is. Okay? So what do we mean by that? Let's say, for argument's sake, I don't know, what's a mitzvah? Let's find an example. What's a mitzvah where we know? There we go. Honoring parents. Everybody's always going to find honoring parents. Why? Because it's associated with long life. So we like that. We like a mitzvah that is associated with long life. So mischara neida mehusa, from the reward that is associated with the mitzvah, you can understand the core of the mitzvah. So what's the link between long life or honoring a parent? What's the link? Exactly, because parents are the ones who give us life. So therefore, mischara, from the reward that is associated with that mitzvah, you can understand what the core of the mitzvah is all about. It's acknowledging those who gave us life, and therefore the reward is commensurate. The reward is life itself. Okay, so mischara neida mehusa. What's that?
Saying it's in this world.
In this world, that we can debate. There's a famous Gemara about whether it's in this world or not. But I'm saying this anyhow, not for now. So the bottom line is that if you understand what the essence of a mitzvah is, then you understand what the essence of its reward is. And sometimes you don't know the essence of the mitzvah, so you have to look at the reward in order to understand what the mitzvah is all about. So now, learning Torah lishma. What is the reward? What is the response? What is the value of learning Torah lishma? What does a person get for learning Torah lishma? What does it say? A whole lot of things. Yes? That's what it sounds like. But it's actually not. That's not the case. And this is what's so important about what we're about to study. You see, the value and the reward of learning Torah, especially when a person learns Torah lishma, is the connection that they create between themselves and Hashem. That is the ultimate reward of learning Torah. Let's understand what that means beyond everything. Let's understand what that means. When a person learns something, how does it work? It's a funny question, right? How does learning work? Okay, let's ask the question slightly differently. How do you know when you've learned? At which point can you say, I've learned this particular subject. When it's integrated, yes? And that's why we talk about 3 stages of intellect. We talk about chokhmah, bina, and da'as. Where chokhmah is usually the most exciting part of learning and the most transient part of learning. So chokhmah is where you go to a talk or you read a book or you listen to a podcast and you're like, wow, that was amazing. That's absolutely incredible. And then 5 minutes later, somebody says, what was the talk about? So you go back home, right? You say, I've just been to the most amazing lecture. And they ask us, what was the lecture about? I don't know. Because chokhmah is very exciting, but it's very underdeveloped. And most of the learning process is what we call bina. Bina comes from the word binyan. That's when you build, you flesh it out, you give it depth, you give it breadth, you create more insight, more detail, etc. That's really where the real learning happens. This exploration and research and debate and comparisons. So that's really where the learning happens. Now, if a person has gone through a very deep, meaningful bina process, where is this information now? In their brain, yes? Yeah? That's what happens in bina. Bina happens, it goes into your brain. That's what bina does. So chokhmah means that the information is in the periphery to the extent that it excites you. And bina is where the information is actually in your mind to the point that you understand it. Now, let's use a little example. Let's say, this is completely hypothetical, but let's just say that there was a GP, a regular doctor who used to do house calls, because this is in the 1960s, this particular story, and it's the beginning of the winter season, and starts to notice that certain of the patients, every year, at this time of the year, as it starts to get colder, the change of season, certain patients start to develop a chronic cough every single year. And while the doctor is seeing out the last patient of the day who's coughing their way out of the rooms, suddenly you see it's Freudian, right? So as he's seeing the last person out, he suddenly has this light bulb moment. 1 second, this person who gets this cough every single year is a smoker. I wonder if maybe there's a correlation between smoking and this cough that people get every single year. And he goes back and he looks at the files and starts to call up all the patients who have this chronic coughing complaint, and turns out, sure enough, that they smoke. So he has now experienced what we call chokhmah. Now, 2 things could happen at this point in time. It's like those choose your own adventure books, right? He can choose now what he's going to do next. Either what he's going to say is, that's interesting, put away all the files, and carry on the next day as if nothing happened, and just put it down to a curiosity. And that's how it happens many times when we experience chokhmah. Wow, that was interesting. I really enjoyed it at the time. I must, as we always tell ourselves, I must make a note of remembering this for the future. And zap, within a couple of hours, it's gone. But in our particular case, the doctor decides not to do that, and he's going to burn the midnight lamp, and he takes all these files home and he starts poring over them, and he decides he's going to run a little casual experiment in his practice. And he's going to start to pay close attention to the smokers in his practice and see if there is a link between smoking and any kind of lung deficiency or even lung disease. And he does this over 6 months, and sure enough, he starts to find a correlation. So he phones a few of his friends in the next winter season and says, have you ever observed amongst your patients that there is a link between the smokers and the people who have this chronic lung complaint? And sure enough, he starts to collate information, and eventually becomes so interesting to him that he takes a sabbatical from his practice to go and research if there is a link between smoking and lung disease. And by the end of that year of his sabbatical, he has made incredible progress, and he's amassed a fortune of research, including biopsies and scans and who knows whatever else he's done over there. And he is now ready, x-rays, and he's now ready at that point to present his findings now to the local medical boards, who are very excited about his findings, and they fund more years of research, and he goes in, and eventually, we'll shortcut the story, eventually he is nominated for a Nobel Prize in Medicine because he has found this incredibly important development that smoking causes lung disease. And there he is, he receives the Nobel Prize, and he's got to make an acceptance speech, and it's many weeks of preparation, and it's very stressful because they're all these bigwigs of the medical world are going to be sitting there in the audience, and they're all going to be listening to his research, and obviously there's questions and answers after. It's an incredibly stressful experience, and by the end of it he gets his Nobel Prize, and they go for this cocktail dinner to celebrate, and now it's the first time that he's relieving his stress after months and months of preparation. And so what does he do? While everybody goes for cocktails, he steps outside for a smoke. And the reason is because Bina does not integrate information. And it's possible for a person to have a tremendous amount of academic knowledge and they haven't necessarily integrated information. And the integration of information is what we call da'as. In fact, it's coming up in not this week's, but next week's parasha, where the Torah describes what kind of a person had to be the architect of the Mishkan. You look in Rashi, and Rashi points out the difference between these different faculties of intellect. So when a person integrates information into their mind, then that information is no longer book knowledge, it is now my reality. Big difference. So any time that we integrate information, that's why we have to be so discerning about what information we allow into our heads. Because whatever gets inside our brain, if it's integrated into our system, becomes our reality. And that becomes our perception of the world, it becomes our set of values, it becomes how we live our lives. So we've got to be really careful about what we allow in. The filters have to be strong. If a person invites Torah into their mind, then you have godly wisdom living inside your head. What greater reward could you ask for? This intimate relationship between ourselves and divine infinite wisdom. I mean, you really do not get anything greater than that. What they're going to offer us now, Devarim Harbe, a whole long list of other things. So, Mischara Neida Muhusa, from understanding what the real reward of Torah is, we understand the essence of what Torah is. Torah is not a means to an end. Torah is the essence. It's not like other things in our lives where we do in order, because that will benefit us in a particular way or bring us a particular result. That's why Torah is lishma. We learn Torah, well, we should at least, and that's the premise of this particular teaching by Rabbi Meir, is that the Torah learning should be lishma. It should be focused on the value that is absolute within Torah. I don't need anything else. Now here's the big question. If a person has this very personal, deep, intimate relationship with Torah, are they going to be a different human being? That's the question.
If they actually behave in the way.
Okay, so that's that's not what I asked. If they behave is an if. My question was, if a person learns, will they automatically behave? And this is a critical mistake that people need to be aware of. That it's not automatic. That's the point of this whole teaching of Rabbi Meir. That a person who learns Torah, yes, absolutely, divine wisdom becomes the reality that person looks at the world with. And that's obviously going to change our entire perspective, but nobody should ever make the mistake of thinking that if you learn Torah, that's it, you're now fixed, and everything's fine. There is still work to be done. And that's why Zoiche lidvarim harbe, Zoiche also, besides meaning merit, comes from the word, from last week's parasha, zach, which is pure or clear. Zoiche lidvarim harbe, what Torah does for us, it makes our perception clearer and more refined, so that when we are supposed to work on ourselves, we have an advantage. That's the thrust of Rabbi Meir's teaching. And you'll see this in the particular things that are on our list. And it's a lengthy list of these accolades that are associated with the person who learns Torah properly, lishma, for its sake. You will see that some of these things are descriptions of the person, the first few. And some of them, you'll notice the language is really specific. He's not talking about a magical formula, waving a spiritual wand and turning somebody into a tzaddik. He's actually saying the Torah will just give us the advantage to be able to progress in personal development. Now, let's not forget that Torah comes from the word hoyra'ah, which is instruction or lessons. The entire purpose of Torah is not the knowledge, but the application of that knowledge. And the application of that knowledge requires further work even after we have the knowledge. This is what Rabbi Meir is teaching us. So, we can effectively split this teaching into a few different segments. The first segment is going to describe the person. What happens to the person when the person learns Torah? So he tells us, Nikra, the person who learns Torah Lishma, is called a few titles, the first of which is Re'ah. What's a Re'ah? Not to be confused with the Re'ah that's spelled with an Aleph, which is a lung. This is the Re'ah with an ayin. Where do we know that word from? Where have we heard that word? Where? Re'im ha'ahuvim. We say at chuppah, yes, at Sheva Brachos. Where else do we know that word from? Ve'ahavta le're'acha ka'moicha. Right? Which somehow got totally corrupted in the translation as your neighbor. Re'acha is not your neighbor. A shachen is a neighbor. It's not your friend. A chaver is a friend. So what are re'im? And that's why re'im ha'ahuvim is actually a really good term, a phrase for us to use. What do we mean when we say re'im ha'ahuvim in the Sheva Brachos? Ahuvim is the beloved part. But what's re'im? Companions. companions. Now, the symbolism of a companion is that there's a sense of peership, there's a sense of similarity. You could have a friend who's completely different to you. That's possible. And you could have a neighbor, obviously, who is completely different to you. I had the shocking Johannesburg experience just Erev Shabbos to meet my neighbor. Right? Doesn't happen often in Joburg. I met my neighbor. Right? There was some crisis on the street, so the neighbors got to meet. So you can have a neighbor. I discovered my neighbor is incredibly different to me. Maybe on the polar end of the spectrum. So neighbors, friends are not the same as a companion. A companion implies that there's kinship, and a companion implies that there's a certain degree of similarity. So we've quoted now Re'em Ha'ahuvim and Ve'ahavta l'recha kamoicha. So please, can we do the one other very famous phrase? I'll give you a clue. It's from Tehillim that has the word Re'ah in it as well. And everybody's scanning all the Tehillim, right? It's going to take long because it's far down, right? What's it? Tehillim 125, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Right? So it's a long way down, sister. What's it? Shall I give you another clue? Think of a very popular moving Karlbach nigun. Lema'an achai v're'ai, right? For the sake of my, they say friends. That's usually how we translate it, right? Lema'an achai, my brothers, and re'ai, my friends. Now, how does that pasuk continue? Lema'an beis Hashem, for the sake of the house of Hashem, which is what? The Beis HaMikdash. The implication of that pasuk is that achai v're'ai, to have a relationship like brothers or a relationship like companions, that is described in that Tehillim, is at the time of Beis Hashem, at the time of the Beis HaMikdash. In other words, during the time of the Beis HaMikdash, we had a very unique level of relationship with Hashem that we don't have now. The level of achai v're'ai, that our relationship between us and Hashem was similar to the relationship of siblings or similar to the relationship of companions. That means to say we were in a very elevated state at the time the Beis HaMikdash stood, and because of that elevated state, we felt like we were companions of Hashem. In the time of Golus, without the Beis HaMikdash, we've lost that. Mostly. So where do we find it? Where do we recapture that closeness to Hashem? So the Gemara tells us that from Mishachar Beis HaMikdash, from the time the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, Ein loy lahakadosh baruch hu ba'olamoi, Hashem does not have a space within His world, ela b'dalad amoy shel halacha, except in the space where halacha is learnt. What does halacha mean? We've discussed this once before. What's the difference between saying din and halacha?
The way you mean say.
Din, correct. So din is law. Din is very formal. It's very like the legal system. Halacha comes from the root holeich. Holeich, which is how you not just conduct yourself, but even more importantly than that, how you progress. How you progress. The very famous nevuah of the nevuah of Yeshaya, the prophecy of Yeshaya, where Hashem says to him, Hashem shows him the angels, and He says the angels are oimdim. They stay in a specific stagnant spiritual state, and you will be mahalchim. You will have the opportunity to grow and progress in your spirituality. How does a person grow and progress? Through what? Through Torah. So in other words, the Beis HaMikdash was this, not just a physical place where we made pilgrimage, but it was a conductor of divine energy into the world, and because of that created this tremendous awareness of Hashem and this closeness to Hashem, to the extent that we were all called Re'em Ha'ahuvim. We were called the beloved companions of Hashem. And then we lost that. There was a disconnect. And the only place that we can rediscover and recreate that level of companionship is where? In learning Torah in a way of halicha, in learning Torah in a way that it propels us to growth. And the only way that Torah propels us to growth is oisek b'Torah lishma. When a person is engaged with learning Torah for its sake, therefore, Rabbi Meir says over here, nikra reya. This person who is engaged in Torah learning for its sake is now once again called Hashem's companion, even at a time where broadly as a nation we have lost the opportunity to be Hashem's companion. So there's always a way back, and in this case He's telling us the way back is through the learning of Torah Lishma. So that's the first accolade that it gives us. The second accolade is, so his Nikra Re'ah is called somebody who is a companion of Hashem, and then he's called Ahuv. So there you have that expression, Re'im Hu Ahuvim. It's exactly that expression. So we are considered a companion of Hashem, and we are considered Ahuv, beloved to Hashem. The Maharal says something really fascinating. He says, we know very famously, the Medrash tells us, Estakel be'oraisa ubara alma, that the way Hashem created the world is, he, quote unquote, consulted the Torah, which is considered the blueprint of creation. So Hashem looked at the Torah and then created the world. Now, needless to say, that is metaphoric, but what do you think it's trying to tell us? That Hashem looked at the Torah and then he created the world. What do you think the message is? That what? The world is created within the framework of Torah, absolutely. Now let's take it even one step deeper.
Torah is the framework of the world.
Torah is the framework of the world, so the blueprint. Let's take it a little deeper. There is no value to the world except for the value that it brings to the Torah. In other words, every single thing that happens in the world has to be designed in order to suit what Hashem's plan is for the world, which is effectively what the Torah tells us. Now, just parenthetically, it's a little off topic, but it's quite a valuable thing to remember. Any time that we experience something in our lives that we feel is spiritually insurmountable, and I'm not saying that ever happens to you, but I know some people. So if you ever feel that there's, for example, a specific temptation that you don't think you're ever going to conquer. Some people have that, right? I'm very good, I'm ready from in a whole bunch of areas, but this particular area, I don't really believe I'm ever going to master. So for one person, it's anger management, and for another person, it's envy, and for another person, it's Lashon Hara, and for another person, it's getting up in the morning, and everybody's got their vice, and there's no way I'm going to overcome that. Or alternatively, everybody looks at a particular character flaw and says, well, what do you want? Hashem designed me this way, so I'm really good at a whole bunch of things that Judaism expects, but I have this design flaw and it's just unfortunate, and you've got to take me as I am because that's how I was made. Now, when we look at it from this perspective, we understand Istakel Baraisa Ubara Alma, that Hashem consulted the Torah in order to create the world. So let's just think about that. That means that Hashem consulted with the Torah when He created me. That means that when He created me with my particular character flaws, and with my particular temptations and my particular distractions, were those temptations, distractions, and character flaws from the Torah or from somewhere else? They're from the Torah, right? What does that tell me? That there's got to be a process through the Torah to correct that character flaw, overcome that temptation, or deal with that distraction. Because if I believe for 1 second that there is no way, then I'm denying the fact that it's Istakel Baraisa, that Hashem looked into the Torah in order to create the world. Because I'm saying, well, here's part of the world that's like kind of out of His jurisdiction. This is part Hashem can't control. Me. There's this, the part of my character that's so bad, even Hashem can't fix it. That would be a terrible way to look at things. So the Maharal tells us that because Hashem uses the Torah as the template in order to create the world, therefore, a person who truly absorbs Torah the way it is meant to be, ha'oiseg b'Torah lishma, becomes somebody who is effectively helping not just to sustain, but actually to create the world. Because by learning and applying Torah, we are creating the world Hashem intended. The world we're living in is the raw world that we were then intended to take and transform. In the same way as we're supposed to make wheat into bread and wool into clothing, we're supposed to make the world into the divine version of the world. So the person who's oisik about Torah lishma, the person who's engaged in Torah study for its sake, that means the person is dedicated to what Hashem wants, rather than the degree I'm going to get, the title I'm going to have, what I'm going to learn about how I should be a better Jew. This is a person who's dedicated to learn Torah as Hashem wants, becomes Hashem's companion. Because this person is actually now a partner in building the world that Hashem intended, the world that Hashem saw in the blueprint of the Torah, and then invited us to build. Needless to say that if somebody is doing what Hashem wants, says the Maharal, Ahuv, that person is obviously beloved to Hashem, because they're achieving Hashem's goals and objectives for the world. So obviously that person is an Ahuv, a beloved person. And therefore it's going to be reciprocal. So he continues, says, Re'ah, Ahuv, Oyehev es hamakom. It's reciprocal. Not only does Hashem love the person because this person is in fact doing what the purpose of creation is and helping to take the world to its purpose, but this person is obviously also conscious of Hashem and therefore Oyehev es hamakom, loves Hashem. Now when it comes to doing Judaism, there are different ways that people do Judaism. There are those people who unfortunately were born from. It's a liability. And the reason it's a liability is because we are so used to behaving a particular way that we don't necessarily invest in doing those things. And so you get the one kind of Jewish person who is so used to doing Jewish things that they don't necessarily think about it or feel for it. I'll tell you a story that happened to somebody I know. Okay, fine, it happened to me. So I was a little kid, and my parents had these friends over, and they decided they were going to illustrate something to the friends using me as the model. So I was a little kid, and I remember it was in the evening, and I was going through that stage of being frightened of the dark, that stage, and they told me to go get some arbitrary thing from some other room in the house. So I literally had to go as fast as I could because, who knows who could have been lurking in any of those rooms. So I ran to get whatever it was, and I ran back, and when I came back, they were chuckling, and they said, "You see what was going on?" They wanted to illustrate to these friends who were not particularly religious that even with all the high speed of running to the room and back, my hand shot out to kiss the mezuzah on every doorpost on the way in and on the way out. So for some people that's a great achievement. That's like your gold medal in Jewish Olympics. But to be honest, for me, it becomes a conditioned response when a person does that. And then kissing the mezuzah doesn't necessarily have much value. And the reason we're supposed to do it, incidentally, is to draw consciousness to the fact that there's a mezuzah, which represents Hashem, who is looking after us in our homes, and therefore we should behave in a particular way in our homes. Right? None of that happens when you're just like, chicken, So that's one kind of Judaism, is where a person is so accustomed to Judaism because this is what we've done from the youngest age, so we just do it. I often joke with the guys who come to the early morning minyan that there are some people who arrive at shul and they only wake up halfway through the davening. So you're able to put on your tefillin and say the words and without any consciousness whatsoever. Then you have other people. You get other people, their entire Judaism is based on a sense of fear. And this feeds right into all the various challenges psychologically that Jews are predisposed to. OCD, guilt conscience, things like that. So what happens? The person who lives with fear, I don't know, am I doing this right? What if I don't do it right? What if no one will ever eat in my house because my house is not kosher enough for them? Right? What if I don't clean up properly won't say the word. It's getting too close. Getting too close. Right? What if one day after 120 years I arrive on the other side and they tell me, wonderful, but you didn't live your potential. Right? So there's this whole fear-based kind of Judaism. And it's valuable because it motivates people, gets us to do what we're supposed to do, but ultimately the greatest is love of Hashem. So Oyehev es hamakom, the person who's driven by learning Torah for its sake, naturally the Torah doesn't make love of Hashem, but the consciousness that the Torah brings makes love of Hashem. Because one of the biggest challenges that we have to ask ourselves about Judaism is, how can Judaism instruct us how to feel? You ever thought about this? Yeah. So we say the Shema, the most famous Jewish prayer that every single person knows. And what does it say? Ve'ahavta es Hashem elokecha. You must love Hashem your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your might. And we don't even know what those things are. But how do you tell me ve'ahavta, that I have to love Hashem? You can't tell me that. If your kids, God forbid, are having a fight, so you can tell them, don't talk to each other like that. This is not how we speak in our family. We don't hit in our family. You could say, apologize. You could say, each go to your room. You can't tell your kids, love each other. Either they do or they don't. How do you instruct love? Now, it's compounded when we're told to love an abstract entity. Tell me to love a person, okay, I can get to know them. Maybe they're a nice person, and then I'll love them. But Hashem is completely abstract. How do we have a tangible human emotion for a being that is completely abstract? How? Anybody know? Action, sometimes. So, right, habituated action. So I want to know, can we just do a quick test? And I hope this is safe for me to do in this crowd. But if a man does actions like buys flowers for his wife every single Friday, does that deepen the love between them? Yes? Depends, exactly. Obviously it depends.
It also depends, also can become habitual.
Exactly. Can become habitual. The guy goes to chassan classes and they tell him that you should really get your wife flowers before Shabbos. So he's a very smart person. So he goes onto Net Florist and he sets up a recurring thing for flowers to be delivered every single Shabbos. So does the wife appreciate getting flowers? Yes. Does she feel the love? Not necessarily. Right? So what is it that produces love, particularly for something that is intangible, is
To give.
meditation, actually. Not meditation in the classical sense, you go, clear your mind, but to meditate on Hashem's greatness, which is exactly what happens in human relationships as well. The reason that people, and I hate the expression, I actually hate both sides, falling in or falling out of love. It's all nonsense. You fall over your shoelaces, you don't fall into love, right? But people use this expression today, this falling out of love. We've drifted. Nobody drifts. It just means nobody invested. So in exactly the same way as it is in human relationships, if we use our mind just to think a little bit about the value of the other person, whoever that person is, could be a child, could be a spouse, could be a business partner, could be a friend, could be a parent, doesn't matter. If we don't apply our minds and actually think occasionally about what, number one, is special about them, number two, why I liked this person or loved this person in the first place, number three, all the amazing things they do or put up with, depending on the circumstances. So unless we're thinking about those things, love has no fuel.
It's actually gratitude.
Gratitude might be part of it, right? But it's consciousness. The point is, it is mental consciousness, or like they say in today's world, mindfulness. Right? It's got to start with the head. True love starts in the mind, although it might sometimes be stimulated by a brief emotional outburst, which is the emotional equivalent of chokhmah, and therefore will run out of steam like chokhmah. If you don't feed chokhmah, it dies. If you don't feed love, it dies. That's why in the Kabbalistic graph, that they always use of the spheroids, there's a link between chokhmah and chesed. Chesed is the epicenter of love. So if you don't feed it, it dies. That's the nature of love. What feeds love, not only what feeds love, what grows love is the mind, consciousness, awareness, mindfulness. And so when a person learns Torah Lishma, that means that they're investing their mind in the Torah, which, besides obviously telling us all kinds of things about being Jewish, huge chunks of the Torah, which we're supposed to learn, speak about Hashem himself. Not just about our obligations to him. In fact, according to the Sefer HaChinuch, there are only 6 mitzvahs that are possible that you could do any time of the day and every time of the day, 24/7. And those mitzvahs are belief in Hashem, love of Hashem, fear of Hashem, and then various others. But what's the core of the whole of Judaism? Consciousness of Hashem. Consciousness of Hashem. So when a person is learning Torah Lishma, they're learning Torah the way that Torah is supposed to be learned, not just skipping to the sections that interest me or have practical application. I'm actually looking for the Torah's message itself. Naturally, I will end up loving Hashem. Because love is driven by mindfulness, by conscious focus, not just by waiting for the wave of emotion that may or may not come, depending on circumstances. And then not only that, but oiheves habrios. When a person looks at the world through the lens of Torah, then you understand estakol ba'oraisa ubara alma, that Hashem looked into the Torah and that's how he created the world. That means that he created every part of the world. We've already spoken about our own character flaws as being created by Hashem and having a purpose according to the Torah. So how much more so do we have to say the same for those people? You know who those people are. We already learned about them in the first perek, for ththose people who can cast their minds back all the way to the first perek. What do we see? Hillel says that we learn from Aaron, the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, that oyeheves habrios, same expression exactly that we're using over here. Oyeheves habrios, that you have to love the, how do you translate brios? Beings. Humanity is a very euphemistic English translation. But the direct translation of brios is beings or creatures, if you really want, which effectively is those people. Because we have our people and then we have those people. Our people are the ones that we're quite proud to say they're Jewish because they bring us a lot of pride and nachas, and they're good to be around. And then there are those people who we wish would just disappear off the face of the earth, or at least not identify as Jewish anymore, because we just don't see the value in them. So now we've got to ask ourselves the question. I'm not going to use names, but everybody here could think of a few names. In the South African context, we have our few names of people. Those embarrassments of Jews. How can they side with our enemies? Blah, blah, blah. We all know the story, right? So what happens? We look at that person and say, I don't see why did Hashem make these people? Why did he make these people? They're only tourists. They've only caused us untold trouble in our lives. So the only thing that we could come up with to justify their existence is the fact that Hashem created them. That's why we call them briois. I don't see any value. In fact, to me, it's all negative, but Hashem created them. So now when you look through the perspective of Oisek B'Torah Lishma, when a person is studying Torah the way that Hashem intended it, which is that you understand that Estakel, Boiraisa, Ubora, Alma, that Hashem looked into the Torah and that's how he created the world. Am I willing to be forgiving? Unfortunately, we are too forgiving sometimes. Of our own character flaws? We are. We are. Are we willing to be forgiving of the next person's character flaws? Not so much. Especially those people, the briois, the fringe people who cause us so much trouble. But when a person looks through the lens of the Torah, you realize Hashem created this individual, and therefore this individual, A, has a purpose, B, has as much potential and value as I have. I should be compassionate, empathetic, or maybe not, sympathetic to the fact that this person has no inkling of what their value is. So the person who learns Torah Lishma is oihe v'sabrios. He can even find a way to love those people that everybody else has sidelined. Not necessarily to love them in their current iteration, not to love their character, not to love their behavior, but to love them because they intrinsically must have value. Otherwise Hashem would not have introduced them into his story, into his world. Okay, that's already a high level, yes? Would you agree? That's a high level? Nothing compared to what's coming next.
That's very high.
Very high. Nothing compared to what's coming next. Because the next things that he says are mesameach es hamakim umesameach es habrios. That this is somebody who brings joy to Hashem and brings joy to his creations. What does that mean? What's the difference between loving someone and bringing joy to someone? Now, I said we're going to talk about Simcha, right? It's a month of Adar. We have to talk about Simcha. So here you go. Mesameach es hamokim, mesameach es habrios, to bring joy to Hashem and to bring joy to beings. What does that mean? What do you mean bring joy? Can you bring joy to Hashem? I mean, what is the implication? We understand if you talk about bringing joy to other people, you can assume that those people are perhaps not joyous. So they need us. We're going to help them. We're going to bring them joy. But how do you say Mesameach es hamokim? What a chutzpah. We're going to bring joy to Hashem? How? So 1 second. Are we implying that Hashem, so to speak, is lacking in joy, that we will then add, through whatever behaviors we follow, to now give him joy? What does that mean?
I guess about like what you say about James Barrow. For us to bring him joy, then we'll bring him joy to see we have the joy.
Okay, so again, so you're suggesting that if we have simcha in our, and enthusiasm, passion, whatever, in our mitzvahs that we do, that will give Hashem joy because it's better than if we were doing a parot. I still hold the original question. If Hashem is perfect and Hashem is infinite, how do we add anything to Hashem? How do you give Hashem joy? If you want to say we love Hashem, that makes a lot of sense. That's us. That's our growth. Even if you want to say we are beloved to Hashem, that makes sense because we fit into the category of an existing love that Hashem has. But mesameach implies that we are being proactive, that we are bringing simcha to Hashem. How is that possible?
I think there's that saying that don't do unto others that you will not have done to you.
Correct.
So if you can have that humility and you let Hashem in, and you realize that this is you love Hashem so much that you see that everybody has a spark of Hashem, and that's how you do it.
So that is love. But what's simcha?
Simcha is when you forget yourself.
Okay.
And then the Shekhinah comes in.
Good. So simcha is letting go of self. That's good.
Yes.
That's good information. It still doesn't help us understand how we add simcha to Hashem.
Well, there's this German philosopher, and he said happiness is a solid, and joy is a liquid.
Okay.
So the thing is that we can actually say serve Hashem with joy.
Right.
Now that is very.
But that's different. That is different to what we're discussing here.
To bring joy.
To serve Hashem with joy means I have the joy. That makes perfect sense. But misameach, that I give Hashem joy, how's that possible?
Like
When
his
you
children, no?
When you see people acting in a way that falls in alignment with your philosophy, it brings you joy.
Okay, so that's a human experience. Yes, in a human experience. No, I'm not disagreeing. I'm just saying we're using a human example. That a human being, if I see that somebody is living aligned with my values, will bring me joy. So let's project that onto Hashem and say Hashem is our creator, gets joy when we're aligned with his principles or values. Okay?
But Hashem created the world not perfect, and maybe He left that room.
That's true. The world is imperfect, and therefore there's a lot of room for improvement in the world. But Hashem is perfect. And here we're using the expression Mesameach esamokon, that you're bringing joy to Hashem. Okay?
You can anger Him, so you can.
Well, can you? That's another question. Can you really anger Hashem? Remember, even Bilam, who tried so hard to find that rega, that 1/24th of a minute. Okay, but what was he looking for? Not anger. We don't use the word ka'as. We never use the word ka'as with regards to Hashem. We use the word. What do we use? Charoin af. Charoin af. And Rashi says very clearly to us that charoin af is the flaring of nostrils, which is showing anger as opposed to feeling anger. It's a big difference. Very big difference.
So he turns his face against us.
But it's not that he feels anger. So how are we mesameach esamokim? Here's the real key question. So, but how does that add simcha? How can you add simcha to a perfect being? And the Maharal says specifically that simcha is associated with shleimus. It is associated with perfection. That's actually where simcha happens. Isn't that fascinating? So, mesameach esabrios, let's start there. How do you bring simcha to other people who you really don't like? Because these are the brios, these are the fringe people. You want to love those people, that's a very high level. How do you ever get to a state of simcha? In other words, if we were to confront one of those individuals who, as far as we are concerned, are doing more damage to the Jewish nation than any of our anti-Semitic enemies, how do we have mesameach esabri? How do you bring simcha to them? So there's one thing that we have to know about simcha. The most important thing that we have to know about simcha. Simcha is poretzes geder. That's the expression. Simcha breaks barriers. And we know this from our own experience. Because any time in our lives that we have had a real simcha, we have behaved in a way that does not conform to our normal selves. That's what simcha does. It breaks down the existing persona. So whether it is the way that a person, for example, dances at their child's wedding, which is something you don't even know where you found the strength. This is the person who huffs and puffs up the stairs, but now at their child's simcha, they're dancing like there's no tomorrow. Or when a person has the birth of their first child and they don't know where to put themselves, because not only your first child, actually, the birth of any child. You don't know where to put yourself because there's so much simcha and you walk around and the whole world is rosy colored. Or the person who has, and this is a real thing by the way, you will notice that there are people during the time of a heightened simcha, they will generally give more tzedakah than they would normally give, because the geder, the normal rules, don't apply in a time of simcha. In other words, what it's telling us over here is incredibly powerful. That genuine study of Torah leads us to genuine simcha. Genuine simcha breaks down the barriers that impede our connections to people who are different to us or who are hurtful to us. So, oisek b'Torah lishma, the person who engages in Torah study the correct way, with the intention of doing what the Torah wants as opposed to fulfilling any personal ideal, that person is then empowered to have true simcha, and true simcha breaks the barriers between us and those people we disapprove of, or we don't like, or we find objectionable. That is something that a human being cannot do without this incredible force of the Torah, which is divine. So how's that mesameach esamokim? How does that give simcha to Hashem? So here's a really beautiful thought. Very famously, Midrash tells us that the first word of the Torah, bereshis, can be separated into the letter beis and the word reshis. And that's supposed to teach us that the purpose of the creation of the world was for two things that the Torah describes as reshis. One is the Jewish nation, and one is the Torah. Then the Medrash, sorry? One is the Jewish people, one is the Torah, and one is the Jewish people. Okay? So then the Medrash asks the most important question. Out of the two, which takes precedence? In other words, is the ultimate purpose the Torah or the Jewish people? And the Medrash answers, look in the Torah and you'll see. The Torah keeps saying, Daber el b'nei Yisrael. Tzav es b'nei Yisrael. The Torah is written to service the Jewish people. Meaning to say, the Jewish people are the ultimate purpose of creation, and the Torah is a means to that end. The Torah is there to help us. Now, how's that possible? And the answer to that is because if we get to the essence of what a Jewish neshama is, it is one with Hashem. Mesameach es hamokoim. To be able to bring joy to Hashem, you have to have the infinite capacity of a divine soul. Only the infinite Hashem can add to infinite Hashem. Only a person who is in touch with their infinite neshama can be mesameach, can actually, so to speak, add value, if we can use that expression. This has one big cover yochel in front of it, right, so to speak. Can add simcha to Hashem. We see this elsewhere where the Gemara talks about the fact that Hashem gets nachas from the Jewish people. Misha'asheya, that Hashem gets pleasure from the Jewish people. In the same way as you can't add simcha to an infinite being, you cannot add nachas or pleasure to an infinite being. But because we are, at our core, one with the infinite being, that's how we can add, so to speak, whatever that means, beyond our pay grade to understand what it is, we can add to Hashem. And perhaps that's the reason over here it says, Mesameach es ha-mokoim. Mokoim is the type of godliness that is invested in the world. Because we are linked to godliness that is beyond the world, we can add value to the manifestation of godliness that is in the world. But the only way we get there, we can't find the essence of our neshama on our own. The only way we get there is through the Torah, and specifically through learning Torah Lishma. So when a person learns Torah properly, it engages them with the essence of their being, which brings about in our world, the place of divine manifestation in our world, Mokoim, a simcha that is from beyond our world. Okay, it's a little bit of a tricky topic, but it's quite an empowering thought.
Out of the